Hey, what is up, everybody? This is Silver Spook, and this is the Silver Spook video about human rights and how do we get human rights and what even are human rights, and obviously, how do we enforce those human rights that we supposedly have. So I thought this would be an interesting video to make because of, there's a lot of talk, of course, now. With a good reason about making sure that people in, of course, a particular war zone or a genocide zone, we should say, they're currently going through a lot of obvious violations of their human rights, and there's a lot of obviously action to try to stop this. Sorry, I'm fixing my chat monitor. There's a lot of attempts to try to help those people, right? I'm trying to avoid saying anything for the first little bit because it could help the algorithm, but there's a lot of people that are hoping to support those people that are suffering these massive suffering and violations. But obviously, right, a lot of people are burnt out. A lot of people are questioning their countries, their governments, their societies, their civilizations, questioning many of their preconceptions about who they are, who their countries are, who their people are, who their bosses are, who their friends and family are, because they don't support or they're silent on the violations of the human rights of, the Palestinians, obviously, among others. But, it's kind of like, so I think a lot of people, I've seen a lot of talk about either like giving up, just like a lot of defeatist sort of, oh, I guess, nothing will ever change. So doomery kind of sentiment, human rights, some people, obviously people continue to ask for them, continue to, show up to these actions, which is important. Keep on doing the boycotts, which is important, and all kind of other supportive actions, whatever people can take. Those are all those are all really good things to be doing. And like, I'm not saying like that people shouldn't do those, but I think it's a good time to kind of like examine like what does that mean? There's a bigger conversation around not just human rights, obviously, like democracy, freedom, democracy, rules-based order, what is a good civilization, what is a just, like freedom, equality, justice, all those things that things get talked about frequently that give legitimacy to governments, countries, orders, international organizations, economic, social systems, religious systems, etc. But the human rights specifically, let's look at what the completely unbiased entity, but unfortunately very used by Western people, Wikipedia. Let's see what Wikipedia has to say. Human rights are moral principles or norms or for certain standards of human behavior that are regularly protected in municipal and international law. They are commonly understood as inalienable fundamental rights. Obviously, this comes from 1800s Western liberal thinking, but inalienable fundamental rights to which a person is inherently entitled simply because she or he is a human being, and which are inherent in all human beings, regardless of their age, ethnic origin, location, language, ethnicity, or any other status. They are applicable everywhere and at every time in the sense of being universal. That's interesting, right? So obviously Wikipedia is wrong in that it on the face value, if the right to let's just take one of them, right? Okay, well, the right to education, prohibition of genocide, okay, right to a fair trial, right? These are just some of these human rights, right? So if it's true that human rights are right, if it's true that human rights are applicable everywhere, and they're universal, right? I mean, something is wrong here, right? This is why I say Wikipedia is Western anything, but certainly Wikipedia is not correct on this, because Palestinians are not having their human right to not be genocided, their human right to have. How do you have education when you blew up all the schools? And Palestine is not the only place, right? All the Iraqi, Afghanistan, all the Vietnamese schools you blew up, and also those are all genocides, right? The right to life is like a basic human right, but 6 million, 4 to 6 million Muslims just lost their right to exist for, basically no reason other than a handful of people's profits, or power mongers need to have power over the last 20 years in the Muslim world. So if human rights are universal, right, and applicable everywhere, right? Well, number one, there's a few things, right? Either number one, those countries that are claiming to be the upholders of human rights are not upholders of human rights. Number two, human rights aren't applicable everywhere and they're not universal, or human rights apply to middle to upper middle class white people. Maybe that's what it is, right? Most of them that don't go against the freedom, democracy, Western rules-based order. But I mean, do you see how like the conception of human rights is nonsense, right? I would argue that certainly the European and the collective Western conception of what human rights is just it's incoherent. But everything in the UN actually is incoherent. Actually, the UN itself is a construction. United Nations supposed enforcer of human rights, freedom, justice, democracy, and maintaining kind of order right around the world, right, and helping people prosper, environmental protections. The United Nations is a construction of barbarians, right? The United Nations, which is supposed to enforce human rights, and all of these international organizations, for the most part, certainly the Western created ones, by the U.S. and the Europeans, these are all fundamentally human rights, freedom, and justice, in name organizations. The International Criminal Court, right? The International Court of Justice, right? Israel was just accused of genocide by South Africa, which is great. But the International Court of Justice, the International Criminal Court, the UN, all these international organizations, these are constructed by human rights violators. Serial, constant, chronic, multi-century, if not multi-millennia, human rights violators, specifically the Western entities like the U.S., Britain, France, Canada, Germany. These places where are historically and to the present moment the number one violators, the number one doers, perpetrators of genocide. We go over colonialism frequently on this channel, so I don't want to have to go through that again, just to kind of focus on human rights. But it's kind of like when people think about human rights, I think this is one of those compartmentalization, the kind of waffle, as Holly correctly calls it, the waffle brain of the Western mind, and the siloing, the like fraudulent taxonomy of reality, right? Where it's like, we have human rights and we're fighting for human rights, but historically and in terms of geopolitics, the United States and the European, these don't stand for human rights. They're the number one violators of human rights. But we can still fight for the human rights, and we're still leading the world in human rights as Americans, right? You see, and so that's kind of like when I say how do we get human rights, I'm intentionally being a bit obfuscatory, or I'm intentionally kind of being vague, because what does it mean to have a human right? What is it like? What does that mean, right? It's like natural inalienable rights, right? Inalienable is just interesting word, right? Like what is inalienable, right? When Thomas Jefferson, right? This, a celebrated thinker. I'm being generous in the beginning. Thomas Jefferson, he said that life, liberty, pursuit of happiness are these so-called inalienable rights, right? And these are self-evident truth. This is in the supposedly the greatest document ever written in the history of the world, right? One of the founding American documents of the so-called greatest country in the world. And Thomas Jefferson said that these truths are self-evident that all men, well, number one, he said all men, so that's interesting. But leaving out half the population, we hold these truths to be self-evident. All men are created equal, that they are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, right? Life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. Okay. Now, of course, all the indigenous people, the global South people, I'm trying to speak to the global minority right now, so you have to forgive me a moment. But unalienable, unable to be taken away from or given away by the possessor, right? And obviously, the number one example is freedom of religion, right? These are constitutional, right? Human rights. Obviously, these are based on indigenous Turtle Island, indigenous Native American, and other civilizations constitutions, right? So this is not original thoughts by Thomas Jefferson, but these are the human rights are, like, according to this description, right, which is the leading, like, this is what the average American, the average Brit would say, like, yeah, of course, this is the way that you are receiving the human rights from God or from nature. They just appear, they just manifest out of the ether, like, it's like, you get your human rights the same way that you get, like, your brain and your eyes, right? Your parents, conceive you, or a test tube and, an artificial womb grows you, or an underpaid surrogate womb from the human rights free Ukraine that migrated to Britain or France and is being used, grows you for what, $500 a month or whatever. And then when you grow, as you manifest into a human being, you just the human rights just appear inside of you, right? This is the way that it's claimed that this happens, right? And so it's kind of but that this now, of course, like, as most metaphysical Western thinking goes, which is disconnected from history, reality, and human society, economics, politics, and actual facts on the ground, right? It's meaningless, right, to say that, like, you just have these rights. I mean, humans feel empathy. You have people, like, if somebody hurts a friend of yours or your family member or you're gonna feel things, and then you will feel like, I need to stop. Like, if somebody is attacking a person that was just standing on the side of the road, most people will feel an urge. I mean, maybe they will not act on it, but they'll feel an urge to try to protect the innocent person that they believe is innocent, from being violated, from being harmed unnecessarily, right? And so, like, that's a thing. But this idea that, like, oh, there are these rights that just come down and descend down, and then now we have them. This is not true, right? This is the human rights. If there are to be any of these rights, this idea of rights and entitlements, the concept of rights and entitlements, these go back. These go back to European conceptions of reality, which are, I would argue, largely divorced from reality, which is to say that, like, the Magna Carta was one of these documents. But the thing is, which is that, like, this is the way that the world operates, and they're just kind of statements, so, like, declarative statements of this is the way the world is. But the world is a rules-based order. The divine right of kings, and this is the way the serfs are, and this is the way the knights are. And this is the way that this feudal system, or this capitalist system, or this, this is the way that this post Great Charter system is going to run, right? Now, but they're said as if these are like, this is what nature is, right? But these are all like overlays over nature. They're enforced by people, right? Generally by an unjust system, like, a billionaire oligarchic funded president of the United States, right? Who is enforcing the will of that billionaire, plutocracy that wants to blow up Iraq and take their oil and gas and resources, right? They're enforced by the oligarchs behind the king in the feudal Europe, which is that we're going to beat up and starve and massacre peasants if they don't give us vast quantities unduly of their wheat and their potatoes and whatever other produce, the fruits of their labor under feudalism. And this is the way the system will be, and we will enforce that with violence and the mass brainwashing of the masses that we get away with as European feudalists, capitalists, imperialists, or whatever. And but these are like these are like this is the natural way of things, right? Like the human rights come down from heaven. No, the human rights don't come down from heaven. The divine right of king comes down out of somewhere. No, it doesn't. It's put there. It's overlaid. It's forced on reality by decisions made by the governments, right? Now, of course, the governments in the West have never been democratic, actually, right? Otherwise, the U.S. would have universal health care, which the vast majority want. If the Western governments were democratic, then there would be no funding of Israel, right? Which the vast majority of Americans want. And most other wars and many other policies, right? So neither the modern Western democracies nor the feudal era, like none of these, like, the way that history and time is visualized and like, laid out and kind of explained, like these arcs of history are nonsensical to from my personal indigenous perspective. But like even taking that, like there was the feudal era and then there was revolutions and then now we're in the democracy, rules, democracy, justice era. None of these times have ever had democracy. So at all times, right, one of the human rights is the right to have a democratic society, right, where what you want, right, healthcare, housing, you would like not all of your resources, right, $4 trillion to go to war that you don't have any interest in fighting. And so the people's, and not you personally can't run everything, but you with all the other members of your society, your country, got to collectively decide. So this concept of democracy as one of the human rights, these so-called natural inalienable rights, right, has never been present ever in the U.S. or ever in Europe. That's why there's organizations like DM25, right, to get democracy for the first time ever in the Occident, right, in what the western end of Eurasia, that is Europe. So and that's another way where it's nonsensical, right? The conception of human rights in the United States in its Constitution by Thomas Jefferson, by the Locke and the Locks and even the Voltaires to a large extent, all of these Western theorists. These are good things to aspire to, but the way that they're conceived as, we simply have them because they just appeared and we said so, right? Without actually critically examining the society they're in, whether that's true, whether that has actually played out, because nobody ever does, right? They just kind of say that, like even nowadays, Americans will just say, well, obviously we have freedom and human rights because they're God-given rights, or they're natural rights. They just are rights, right? I have the freedom to say what I want because I have the freedom of speech. I just have it. Like, well, who gave you that? Like, who allows you to say what you're saying, right? If the freedom of speech was true, then people could say, indigenous people could post, hey, stop stealing my land that you violating treaties on and fracking and drilling oil into, for example, without my permission at the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, such as what, the massive gas and oil companies were doing to the Wet'suwet'en and the Lakota people and countless other people, right? And when you said that, when the indigenous people said that, they were shadow banned off of and banned like long before people were getting disappeared for talking about Palestine. This like recently, like there's much speech that is met with direct violence even inside the West. I mean, especially indigenous, but the black, indigenous people of color, people pushing for their basic human rights, they get silenced. So the freedom of speech is not. People say, well, I have the human rights to my freedom of speech, and it's like that is a luxury of white men, basically. That is a luxury of a particular subset of humanity, right? That believe that this is like coming down from the magical ether, from the fact that you were born, right? This metaphysical, I started my belly button lint and like, I think therefore I am, right? That like the belief that I've discovered something by thinking I think therefore I am is like illustrative of Western white man culture, honestly. Right? It's like as if you've discovered something, right? It's like, you know, people are, you know, the every right that you think that you have is only exists because there are systems in place, right? There are systems, there are governments, there are people with guns, and there are people with bombs, and there are people with prisons, and there are people with missiles and nuclear missiles who let you do, who will threaten to kill and destroy anyone who attempts to get in the way of your quote unquote freedoms as a Western middle class white person. And now it's more looking like upper class white people. Everyone else, your rights are contingent upon whether you fulfill X and Y and Z, and then maybe the United States, Great Britain, France, the EU, right? The international prosperity guardian, although it's not looking too strong nowadays, is it? Right? An international coalition of military forces will beat up and destroy anyone who gets in the way of your vacation, right? Who gets in the way of your personal human rights to keep consuming. I mean, and as long as you keep consuming a correct amount of products under the capitalist system that the U.S. and the Western forces, then they'll enforce it. But if you veer too far off of, right, the limited, you know, Coke and Pepsi flavors of freedom that you can choose between Joe Biden and Donald Trump, and maybe they'll even let you choose that. They're gonna kick Trump off the ballot. So much for your democracy. But long story short, so the human rights. I mean, my point here is that like human rights do not exist out there, without. Human rights do not exist like in an abstract sense, right? In a metaphysical sense, like there is not a human rights written in the cosmic microwave background radiation, right? That the Big Bang left billions of years ago, that says human beings have natural inalienable rights. There's nothing out there that says that, right? That's in the minds of white entitled men like Thomas Jefferson, in barbaric societies where the vast majority, 90+% of people, black slaves, indigenous genocided people, all women, and lower class non-aristocratic men had no rights, right? Free trade was constructed by aristocratic, wealthy lords and ladies in Britain because they were upset that they didn't have the freedom, right? The freedom of navigation that the U.S. is always talking about is based upon this concept of free trade and the freedom to do whatever the British wanted 10,000 miles away, multiple oceans away in the South China Sea and in the Yellow River and in China in general. It's about allowing the British opium, right, to be forced into China against the will of the Chinese people, right? That's what free trade was about. And it has a lot to do, right? It's like, it's a violation of the rights of a tiny minority of the wealthiest, liberal, you know, top hat wearing, monocle penis, you know, the Mr. Peanut from Monopoly Man, you know, wealthy British aristocratic capitalist class to force their products, to make tons of money. And particularly they're very not good products that they're not really products. It's narco trafficking as a money laundering scheme to basically push China down, take their valuable silk and tea and things out, force opium in, and then eventually subjugate the entire country and dominate the planet. Right? So that was what free trade. So the freedom of trade, the freedom of navigation, right? These are you hear these all the time. The United States is violating the freedom of navigation in the South China Sea, and the United States and AUKUS and NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, is here to enforce the freedom, the human rights to freedom of navigation and the free trade that is being violated in the South China Sea. And you notice that suddenly the U.S. is anti-free trade now, right? The U.S. has now turned against and is withdrawing from the World Trade Organization, right? Because the free trade no longer, even the free trade that the West has always, the U.S. and Britain before them have always, championed, not because they cared about freedom or rights or equality, but because that bogus concept has benefited them a bit more in international trade under imperial, colonial, neo-colonial, and imperial structures. But now the Chinese and the non-Western world is winning in that, and the Chinese technology is actually far surpassed the United States. 6G, rocket science tech. Just one of the recent examples. In fact, China, just one example. China recently has won a court case in Germany, which says Amazon can no longer sell Wi-Fi routers in Germany because they infringe on Huawei's Wi-Fi 6 patent. This decision was made by the Munich District Court last week after an oral hearing. If this decision is valid, Amazon will have to compensate Huawei for losses suffered since March 19th, 2020. That's 3 years of losses of billions of dollars, right? The world is changing. 5 years ago, who would believe in American IT would be sued for stealing intellectual property from a Chinese company in Germany? So the thing is, the United States is fighting this. The U.S. will guarantee it. The U.S. is basically, the West is withdrawing from all of these, especially the U.S. is withdrawing from all of these free trade agreements, intellectual property agreements, the World Trade Organization rules of trade, because it doesn't benefit them anymore, right? So these universal ideas of free trade, right, free and equal competition, market economic, even like these concepts. The number one, they've never been actually free. They've always been the one-sided, forced and biased towards a handful of oligarchs coming out of the U.S. and the West and Europe. Number two, they never care about these values, and they prove it every time they can. Every time that the Western oligarchs and the wealthiest billionaires who all operate out of the U.S. and the West, whenever they start, it looks like this rule could be hurting them, they just throw it away. They tear it up, like the same way the British would tear up treaties. They would sign a treaty with native peoples, and then as soon as it's like, well, maybe we can get away with breaking the treaty, they break the treaty, right? So international law, right? International agreements, right? The rights of countries and the peoples to make deals with other countries in a fair, just way. International law, these are nonsense. I would argue Western law is nonsense. It's all might makes right, with many long sentences and millions of people wasting their time getting law degrees. I would argue that's what Western. Now there's justice in other countries, like in China and in Cuba, they have some justice, but in the West, law degrees are time sinks for people who could have been mass organizing and ending the capitalist oligarchic illegitimate system. Right. There's a Palestinian like 18-year-old who said she was thinking about going into human rights law, but after they have watched all of the court cases, all of the lawsuits, the entire world saying, and international experts, lawyers, all saying this is case closed textbook, mountains and mountains of evidence that this is a human rights violation. This is human rights violations. This is genocide, right, of Palestinians. And the Palestinians said, so if I join the millions of existing lawyers in the West, in the US and Europe, and I try to litigate, right, and research and come up with the long list of facts and long list of pictures and logical and rational explanations, and try to win over the the juries at trials, right, about why this is genocide, right? What is the point of doing years and tens of thousands of hours of work, right, litigating using the law, using the so-called court system of the West to get human rights and justice for our Palestinian people, if all the courts will basically, some courts will even rule that the U.S. and Israel committing genocide, but that nothing happens. So that's why I argue, actually, the Western legal system is a giant waste of time for the most part. Like, if you had just governments, systems, economic, political realities, right, that don't exist in the U.S. and Europe and all the NATO, any U.S. vassal country, they don't exist there. If they had a justice system, like in Cuba, you might get some justice, right? In China, they actually behead billionaires. You know, they if you steal more than like $5 million, sometimes you are executed, or you go to prison. For all government officials, right? They actually stop corruption, right? In the West, they have a legalized corruption system. It's called DC. So, like, people are better. And so this Palestinian 18-year-old said, "I'm not going to go into human rights law. I'm going to organize. I might, directly fight the United States, because that's more effective than wasting time in these ridiculous courts, these university halls. What are we doing here? Making money that was being paid by the United States system that blood money they stole from Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, the global South. What is the point of these so-called human rights, Western human rights orgs, legal systems, International Criminal Court, International Court of Justice? Did you see it? It's nonsense, right? And I've said it all the time. I've always been saying this as a native Hawaiian. I watched it. If you follow me for any long period of time, you know that I've been watching kids starve to death in like downtown Honolulu, mass incarcerated, our children stolen, all the things I constantly talk about. Illegal occupation, the whole thing is a mass gross violation of human rights and international law. The United States in Hawaii, everything it does, it's bombing, poisoning our water, letting Lahaina burn, Red Hill, right? Denationalization, ban on the Hawaiian language, mass incarceration unjustly in Hawaii. What they've done on everything they do in Hawaii is illegal. The UN High Commissioner on Human Rights, right? And I bring it up a lot, so I don't. But just in case people are like, "Silver, what are you even talking about? You're making that up." Speaking of human rights, no, it is. I should bring it up. So again, on human rights, specifically in Hawaii, this is the UN High Commissioner on Human Rights. Hawaiian Islands is that of a sovereign nation state that is under a strange form of occupation by the United States from illegal military occupation and fraudulent annexation. And so international law requires that governance and legal matters within the occupied territory of Hawaiian Islands must be administered by the application of the laws of the occupied state, in this case the Hawaiian Kingdom, not the domestic laws of the occupier of the United States. Okay, so but you see, like this person, right? Recently, frequently, this past November, December, multiple UN, the top of the UN, I forget their exact positions, but some of the top UN experts and UN officials, they resigned, right? The person who said that this is a legal expert, right? And he went through the facts, went through all of the information, right? Just like legal experts go through the Palestine-Israel issue, and they basically unanimously are like, it's a genocide. You don't need an 8-year degree to watch all the dead babies every single day, with Israeli soldiers saying, "I saw 6-year-olds playing soccer, and so I shot the Palestinian kids in the head on camera." You have like soldiers just straight up saying, "Yeah, I killed so many babies and I ran out of babies to shoot," and they're just like smiling. Okay, it's like, this we don't need Daredevil and She-Hulk attorney at large and Ally McBeal. We don't need the world's best lawyers to make the case. Law is a joke. To be honest, it's a place to expend the best, very, very, very talented minds, very smart people, and waste their time in these so-called courts. That's what law is for. You want to be 100%. Advanced countries, they don't spend that much time on that. It's because it's too much resources. You should be spending on renewable tech. People should be investigating like How are we going to deal with the capitalist colonial system? And like they should be doing other things, dealing with COVID. But the amount of money and time, the West actually spends disproportionate amounts of money and time and some very, very sharp minds wasted on law. Why? Because billionaires want to hash things out in court, and it wastes the energy of the masses. That's actually the reality. Like some things should be investigated, but there's an amount, and then there's like, clear, obvious, did you do the thing? Did you do the wrong? Did you do something bad? It's obvious that is what Israel has been doing. It's really been obvious forever. Hey, U.S., did you do a bad in Iraq? They killed 1 million in the Iraq War. Obviously, the United States and everyone, the president, the Congress, anyone involved, all the private contractors, military contractors, Lockheed Martin executives, the whole thing, they should all be in prison or hanged in The Hague for their war crimes in Iraq. We don't need lawyers. We don't need human rights lawyers. We don't need 1 million human rights lawyers to figure out that there was a genocide in Vietnam, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Palestine, right? We don't need geniuses to figure out the United States is violating black people's rights. We have cops kneeling on black necks for 8 minutes 46 seconds. The Western pretense that the legal system and law, right, and just really sharp, smart lawyers. This is why they have a lot of law shows and cop shows. That the police and these lawyers and the so-called justice system, right, can write a fundamentally unjust, broken, criminal, capitalist, racist, colonialist, oligarchic, just corrupt, broken U.S. and all Western systems is one of the strong. That's one of the most important liberal lies, that we will come to justice when we vote the right person in, and we have the right lawsuit, and then the president, the good president, right? That's obviously got to be a Democrat. The good president will fix this. Or if you're a Republican, the good president is the Republican president, right? But this is the lie, right? This is why there are lawyers, there are judges, there are human rights activists, there are NGO workers, there are Biden's own staff are like resigning in mass, right? Because they're discovering what should be obvious. It's obvious to the global South. It's obvious to black indigenous people of color that there's no, this is not a just, and there's no possibility of justice in these systems. It's obvious to Yemen, and that's why, and it's obvious to Palestine and the axis of resistance that this is what they have to do, is directly resist militarily and economically, through economic war and direct military kinetic confrontation, resist the Western barbarians, right? The Palestinians are not in Palestine. They're not litigating their way, right? It's obvious to them, right? They're not gonna sue Israel out of Gaza, right? Yemen is not going, we're gonna sue that Maersk ship that's moving missiles and fuel to the port of Eilat for Israel, right? Yemen is not going to sue the ships off. Yemen isn't going to vote the ships out of the Red Sea that are doing genocide. Yemen is just like, if you come through this area to do genocide, we will blow you up. That's how human rights have always operated when there are actual human rights violators, if you want the actual truth. Especially in uncivilized places like the U.S., Europe, and the West. The Anglo-Saxon, Franks, Spaniards, these the unhealed descendants of the Roman Empire. Human rights under barbarous human rights disrespecting societies, cultures, governments, alliances, right? They are never They are never had, right? Human rights are not gotten and enforced in anti-human rights, uncivilized places like the West, through law, voting, democracy, speeches, getting better educations, knowing bigger words, reading more books. I mean, not saying you don't read, but that's not how you're going to get your human rights. They are gotten by fighting and ending these systems. There's economic, and then there's military. Those are the two languages that the West understands. And the West internally succeeds at that by diseducating their population to make them believe that their countries, their leadership are, number one, legitimate. Number two, can be corrected via all of these useless channels that make the populations, the American, and now I don't know who counts as American now. I guess if you're like a 500, if you make 300,000 a year and more, maybe that's everything under that. Maybe you don't count as American anymore. But I mean, if you're white, you kind of get automatic Americanness. But what even counts as whiteness? It's hard to say. But if you are somebody who counts as an American, a European, right, in the eyes of the current oligarchy, that they need that 70% of people. There's about 70% of people that need to think of themselves as white, whether they are or not. Like Nikki Haley is the new Indian white person, middle class American. You have to think of yourself as middle class, or I could aspire to middle classness, right? So those people need to believe that the U.S. is legitimate, or it's not doing too good, but it can be fixed. It can be fixed with like these basic changes and some voting, and we just sue. Well, if we just sue Donald Trump another 25 times, I'm pretty sure that he'll like go away. But anyways, so I think that so this is where the human so my major point is that human rights, they don't exist. They don't exist in a metaphysical. They don't exist in a way that is separate from the politics, the economics, and the histories, and the cultures and the racisms of the places they're in. Right. This is what the critical race theory was trying to make a breakthrough in the legal world, where they said, where like black law students, right, were saying, hey, if we have a society where black people are, prejudiced, stereotyped against, especially by white people, and we have these white juries that are supposed to be giving fair, unbiased justice, but they will instantly always convict, and they will always, and even the judges will be biased to judge a black person as guilty and a white person as innocent just because of their skin color. How can we have justice, right? And that was just the beginning to inquire into this, how do we get justice as one of those human rights? And that is like unacceptable to even talk about. That's just the beginning, right? Of trying to crack that open. And the thing is, and then, and so of course the critical race theory, there's people who still will, well, I mean, it's not formally taught the way they used to be, but it's like, it just, the critical race theory is just now CRT is just like this buzz phrase that means anything that could that it's like the enemy that will destroy America, right? But it's really, it's just the beginning of understanding how human rights actually function. And like most of America is like, don't even want to hear that, right? So, you're in a weird place, but anyway, let's come back to this human rights. So if human rights are not enforced, if human rights are not gotten, and they're not enforced by just any government, to my mind, they're not enforced by the U.S. They're not enforced not at the state level, not at the international level, not internally. If the human rights are the right to eat, the right to have a decent living space, right? If you look at the UN Declaration on Human Rights, the right to free, fair trial, the right to democracy, right? No Westerner, right? Like many Americans, half of the United States is like malnourished at some point in the year. Like they're food insecure, right? Like people are like raiding the food banks, right? And many people are not getting enough to eat. That's already a violation of the human rights in the wealthiest country in the world, right? So it's not because the United States lacks resources because of some external force. The United States is choosing to starve its own population, right? So the United States obviously doesn't enforce human rights of its own, even its own white population. Now that's the biggest paradox, is the white population believe that it's the great enforcer, but it doesn't even support their own rights. Right? There were tweets this week that said, Yemen is about to find out why. There's pictures of the U.S. military warships and planes, all these, like an entire armada, like 100 aircraft carriers, destroyers, corsairs, helicopters, jet fighters, and then this Americans were saying Yemen is about to find out why Americans don't have universal health care. like that was a good thing, right? So it's like people actually will celebrate their lack of human rights. Americans and many even Europeans will celebrate their lack of. The Europeans are also freezing in a lot of their houses right now, and they're pretending like they're in a civilized place when their own governments are acting against them, right? They don't even know that in Europe. It can be even worse than in the U.S. in some places. So you have U.S. and European governments who have sold their people out to throw everything into these needless wars, and to give all their money and access to the top 1% in the U.S. and Europe, and the people still believe that they're bastions of human rights, right? So that's why I say I don't believe that these countries enforce even those human rights. Certainly, the U.S. and Europe do not globally enforce human rights. Otherwise, they wouldn't be all together with the U.S. and the EU and NATO in all of the wars. Afghanistan, I mean, I just named them, right? So all the Middle East, West Asia, AFRICOM, belligerents in the Asia-Pacific, Indo-Asia-Pacific region, right? Trying to make war in Taiwan Strait, blowing up Hawaii, right? So none of these countries, any country that's involved in that, they cannot be said to be enforcing human rights around the world, and not even human rights inside their own countries. So who does enforce human rights? Who does enforce human rights? Okay, well let's look at some of this. Okay, here's one more thing. So somewhat of a side note, but this is from the U.S. Sorry, this is from Britain. Advertisement a while back. Southern Rhodesia, an English country away from England, maintaining wholesome traditions of the old country, but free from her worries, troubles, and burdens. 3 times the size of England. Population: white people 50,000, native people 1 million. An empty paradise awaiting occupation by the right type. This is what Hawaii, the occupation of Hawaii, is based upon, is flooding Hawaii. This is what the U.S. was based on. It was actually Europeans flooding the continent with white people to build a white settler colony. And as the British said, right? Replace this emptiness with the right kind of people, right? And so the United States was founded in anti-human rights, right? The United States, right? If the right to lack of prejudice, the right to not be oppressed based upon race, if that's a human right, the entire founding of the United States is based upon mass human rights violation, namely of Native people and Black people that they genocided, right? Israel is a giant human rights violation, right? Its existence is settler colonial. It is replacement, right, of the native people there, who are actually Semitic people. Unlike unlike Netanyahu, who is actually a non-Semitic Jewish white person, an American from Philadelphia specifically. Like most Israelis are American or European. They're not from the Middle East. They're not from that area. Whatever they might say, right? And so those are all human rights violations, right? This is all human rights violations from the get-go, from the very start, right? That doesn't mean that Britain isn't. I mean, all the wealth of Britain is based upon going around the world and stealing everyone's stuff. But the settler colonies are themselves, their entire existence is illegitimate in that sense. And also Hawaii, very similar. Like, come to Hawaii and have a piece of paradise and maybe stay. The U.S. wants as many white people to stay in Hawaii, right? They flooded Hawaii with these white people and wealthy Asians who work with the United States in order to maintain a military base, build a capitalist imperial launching pad, right? In Hawaii, in Israel, in Taiwan, all around the world. Wherever you, I would argue, actually, I was just playing through Monkey Island, and I was thinking about tropics and Fantasy Island and all that. Israel is a place for, if you're a Jewish person, come and have a great vacation, rave, have some nice sunny beaches. And it's very similar to Hawaii. But the advertising and selling this idea of paradise, again, right? These are the right to travel, the right of freedom of navigation, right? For who? White men, and then white people more generally. They open it up a little bit Irish and Italians suddenly start counting as white when they don't have enough Anglo-Saxons in America to make 70%. And you see that happen in the 1800s and more in the 20th century. They're incorporating Indians and Indians from India and some Mexican Hispanics, some white Hispanics, right, to make that 70%, to pretend like there's human rights and democracy. But the thing is, like, but if you aren't one of those people, then you don't count as a human. You don't count as a human, which itself is a violation. Obviously, just like these publications are violations of human rights in that sense, right? Anyways, here's another one. Okay, so this is getting to who enforces those human rights. Okay, so this is a quote from a Palestinian in Gaza. I always thought that Israel controls Gaza, but today I realize Israel controls all the Muslim countries except Gaza, like Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Egypt, all those countries that are not intervening on behalf of the Palestinians, right? Why? Because Israel, as part of the U.S. white colonial racist capitalist imperialist system, does control those countries, and they do what Israel wants. They support Israel, they fund Israel. They don't get involved. They don't stop the genocide because Israel, with the United States, enforces the global oligarchic racist capitalist system that the Saudi kings, the wealthy bought-off puppets in Egypt's government that is currently shooting down the drones from Yemen to defend Palestine, and the Erdogans that are make a big talk, but then they still send oil to power the genocide machine in Israel, right? And so the reality is that Gaza, who enforces human rights, right? The legitimate government of Gaza, which is Hamas, they have the majority of the votes they won in the elections. They are just the Palestinian government. They're the Palestinian people, right? So it is the people of Gaza, through their government, through their organizations. They have multiple organizations, and it is military resistance of Gaza, of Palestinians, right? That they are getting and will get their liberation, their right to exist, right? As the Palestinians' right to exist as equals, right? To not be under apartheid, with no freedom of navigation, stuck in an open air prison called Gaza Strip. That it is through their own military conflict that they have initiated. By the way, people think that white people and Westerners and the Western world has to save Gaza. The rest of the world, Gaza, the Palestinians have more democracy and freedom and rights than Americans, in the sense that the Americans don't have any government that even will listen to them for their own basic needs, like I just said, right? Whereas the government in Gaza, which is Hamas, is doing what the Palestinians want, which is to push for their liberation through all means necessary, which includes violent direct resistance. By the way, Palestinians are winning this battle. I don't know if you know this. They don't talk about this in the Western media, but the Israelis are actually being kicked out of large sections of North Gaza every day. There's like dozens, if not hundreds, some days, of Israeli soldiers killed, wounded. An Israeli official just said Hamas and the Palestinian fighters could go for months. I think it was Iran or Israel. I think, but they both have admitted this, that there are months and months left of fighting. Israel is already collapsing. Their economy is destroyed. The port of Eilat went from 70,000 to 30,000. Their GDP just dropped by 20%. On all sides, they're being hit. So, like, a ceasefire is a temporary. Not being killed by such huge numbers would be a good thing, but that is in the longer term. All Palestinians suffer. 2 million in Gaza suffer under the siege. The existence of Israel doesn't only threaten the Palestinians; it threatens all people in the Arab world, and it threatens the whole world, right? But so the ceasefire really, at this point in particular, is like, while it like it should have happened, like ceasefire would have been a beginning to a process, but the ceasefire that was called for by every country in the West, the U.S. without whose funding and arms, Israel can't do anything. It can't even exist, right? And all the Americans, with the majority of Americans now calling for the ceasefire, that didn't phase the United States so-called democracy a single bit, right? So Gaza and Palestinians have far more democracy in that sense than any Western country, every Western country, right? So who enforces? So that's the thing, right? It's who actually maintains human rights for populations, right? It's not the West. It is the anti-imperialist. It is the organizations of the oppressed peoples of the world, the colonized peoples like the Palestinians, that are directly rising up and resisting through all means necessary, including violent, including economic, including hybrid war, whatever they need to do in the axis of resistance, to actually get the end of the siege, the genocide, the 1948 to present ongoing genocidal occupation. The thing is, 20,000, 30,000, that's terrible. Israel has been crushing and oppressing millions for decades and decades and decades, right? Almost a century now in Palestine, right? Hundreds of thousands have either been wounded, imprisoned wrongfully, or killed by Israel. So some people are saying, but isn't this a terrible trade-off? Like, look how horrible it is. I mean, it's horrible. It's horrible. But the Palestinians knew it was going to be horrible, right? It's the thing is, the Palestinians couldn't have known what Israel would have done. It's just, we have to save them. Like, number one, white people, you don't have the ability. You don't even have, even if you wanted to, you don't even have the training, or you don't even have the beginnings of what you would need to do anything. Yemen is more able to save. Yemen actually has 2 million armed fighters, a navy, missiles, and anti-ship ballistic missiles. Yemen is more capable to do anything for anyone, especially Palestine, right? The United States can't even get their own government to even move a single iota in any direction, right? So the same for Europe. Europe's even worse. Europe is just doing whatever America wants, what American oligarch wants. So I'm not saying that the protest is useless. It's good. I mean, it helps. It can help. Like it does, like, put some pressure, but it is not sufficient. It is not sufficient. If it was, the genocide would have been done. Right? Western, American, and even inside the Arab country, protests and some boycotts. This is good. It is not sufficient to end the genocide. It is requiring the direct military resistance of the population to make an actual dent. Like, I mean, as part of a larger program, right? Because they'll talk about the free peoples of the free world to assist us, right? And that is good. That's great. But it's not sufficient, because at the end of the day, the West don't respond. They don't respond, except the Western so-called free, so-called human rights respecting countries do not respond except to military force and the economic losses on their balance sheets that they cannot stop. If they start hemorrhaging money too much, maybe they'll think about moving, right? But even still, right? Israel's hemorrhaging money. Like I just said, they lost 20% of their GDP. All the traffic going through the Red Sea is being rerouted. That's a massive loss, right? That's not enough to stop the genocide. If it was just economic, if it's just economic, Israel will keep punishing and destroying Palestine as long as they can, especially an entity like Israel, which is just rabidly ultra racist, just deeply genocidal in nature. The majority of Israel, 60%, it's like 95% of Israel believe that the genocide is legitimate. Either they think Netanyahu killed enough Palestinians, or he should have killed more. That's the majority of Israel. So this idea that, like, if we just if Israel just has enough reprimands, it'll settle down. No, this is not actually true. It's actually absolutely not true. It requires the direct confrontation, Not only that, the direct confrontation is required. The direct confrontation was required to get, the Americans and the Europeans even out in the street. Like I said, the 20, 30,000 deaths of innocent Palestinians was the cost to educate 800 million silent, before October 7th, silent, clueless Westerners. The vast majority, right? Because before October 7th, nobody was in that street. So people who believed that the Palestinians knew this, that it would cause this humanitarian crisis. They knew what Israel would do. That's why they made the choices that they did. They knew they would cause the outcry, and that's why they asked for people to keep sharing it on TikTok and Twitter and social media, all the pictures of all this horrors happening, right? So and that is also what they wanted, because that's part as I said, that's the international outcry is part of the strategy. But really, I think a lot of the international outcry is not necessarily to save the Palestinians, right? The international outcry, I mean, in a certain sense, it will cause a lot of pressure, but not enough pressure. But it's more about awakening Americans and Europeans to the illegitimacy, right, of their country's so-called rules-based, as I said, the rules-based international orders that defend human rights, right? So that's why I'm talking about. I'm trying to basically hammer home the point that the Palestinians, I think, were trying to make to Westerners, to the rest of the world, and many people in Arab countries. Many of them understand it, but some don't, right? Which is that you don't have democracies, you don't have human rights, you don't have freedom of anything. Your countries, America and the Europeans, do not defend human rights. Your countries support genocide 100%. There's not, maybe if we get a better president. No, your current all your presidents. Maybe if the Europeans just get a better human rights lawyer. No. The entire system exists for genocide, and you are basically have irredeemable systems. If you vote in any option for people, I keep saying, this is how I'm talking to. If I see, I can tell by looking at the avatar what they're gonna say, but it's almost always a white person. It's gonna be like, well, if we could just get Jill Stein, or if we got if we got Jill Stein in there, or if we got Bernie Sanders in there, if we got somebody in there, this would all change, right? It's like you are missing the point of that 30,000 Palestinian children and women and men and innocent people and hospital personnel and even UN workers. They have all sacrificed their lives to try to teach you who you are, who your countries are, and you're missing the lesson. If your takeaway is, if we just vote in a better president in the United States, if we just do some more litigation, right? If we just if we just report this to the UN. So I've seen people say that. If we just report this genocide to the UN, do you think the UN doesn't know? Well, if the right people see the truth, right? This is how Western movies are. The journalists, whether that's, Eddie Brock or, some investigator or Scooby-Doo, they get here is the fact sheet. Here is the trial. Here's the legal case. Okay. This is all the data. This is what happened. And then justice is served, right? This is the big lie in Western media, that justice comes out of courtrooms, elections. This is the nonsense. No, justice is going to come out of Hamas and Hezbollah, Yemen, and other resistors killing and destroying the Israeli genocidal military and forcing them into a position where they can no longer commit human rights violations. That's actually how human rights are enforced. Okay, that's the actual truth. That's how China got its human rights enforced. It's by militarily fighting a guerrilla war and resisting imperial occupation, at the time Japan, but of course also the United States. And then kicking out the landlord, undoing the capitalist system, imperial system, and the process of revolution that has built the most advanced country and the greatest human rights successes in China, with 800 million people lifted out of poverty, the world's greatest achievements in poverty alleviation, environmental sustainability, progress, technological progress, building the greatest solar panel, the greatest green technology, and beating the U.S. at its own game of business and economics, and defeating the so-called free trade loving British, who gave birth to America, at their own game. And now Britain is crawling back trying to get a BYD advanced electric car, which is surpassing every European and every American car, and Teslas are all on fire, killing their occupants. So human rights and that process, but the process, like the Chinese still have a military, a very strong military, and they have the support, all the axis of resistance with Russia and Iran and the rest of the axis of resistance, by the way. And China and Yemen actually have good. China actually just said that Yemen actually is doing a very good job at fighting against the imperial hegemonic barbarity. They came out and said that because they understand, because the global majority that have been colonized by the unjust human rights disregarding West, they know who they are, and they know that the American presidents and European leaders and business leaders and political leaders, they'll talk a good game. They'll lecture you about you're violating the rules-based order, and we're very worried about what you're doing in this and that region. You're violating the human rights. They'll talk a big game, right? Why is it China helping our prosperity guardian Israeli oil tanker get escorted to do genocide, right? But they'll talk all about that crap. But at the end of the day, they don't believe in any of that, right? The West is trillions of words written and spewed that mean nothing, right? As you say, the Western words saying, constitution writing, legal scholarship, all that shit, that's just time wasting. So that at the end of the day, they're gonna pull out a gun and blow you away and take your stuff. All that's meaningless. Right? The word saying is to gaslight the masses inside and outside their countries that they are legitimate, but they're all just fucking crooked. They're just crooked fucking gangsters. But the East, the go East and the South know that, and that's why they have to get the human rights in that context. They have to be fought for directly. So anyways, that's that. I already said that one. Chinese companies started to work on a major new, and just some more concrete data on that. Chinese companies have started a major new housing project to provide low and middle income to Iraqis. So as I said, the U.S. bombs. That's a violation of human rights, right? War of aggression, millions of people's human rights, and China is going around and trying to help these countries, right? Because China has been liberated and they have a communist party that enforces the law, and they behead billionaires, and they just sentenced another billionaire to death for corruption. The government they root the corruption out. They don't allow a capitalist system to dominate their people's lives and ruin their lives. The healthcare, housing, and all the things I was saying that people need in China is actually given. The Chinese government actually has a very granular system for making sure that people's needs and requests are being met all the time. That's why they have a 92 to 96% approval rating. The United States has less than 50% at all times. Their government, everyone hates. All Western representative democracies never last above 50%. They all fall under. No Western government, even by their own metrics, are ever legitimate, but in terms of the people's will. Anyway, but in China, but not only inside China, Iraq broke ground on Wednesday on a $2 billion project to build a residential city outside of Baghdad, with two Chinese firms starting construction on 30,000 housing units, and they're planning to construct 5 cities across Iraq. Right, so like poverty alleviation, that is enforcing human rights, right? One way to look at it is the U.S. hasn't, aside from building a token school while plundering billions of dollars from an African country or Arab country, the West hasn't done anything, right? The Europeans, they're still doing colonialism, right? Colonialism is just planetary mass human rights violations, which continues under the neo-colonial system. And so the other thing I wanted to say was that one other. I'm gonna come back to that one, but where's the other one? I want to look for it. In Afghanistan, right? Which as we said, one of the places where human rights are violated was in Afghanistan. War of aggression, massacre of countless civilians, right? Hundreds of thousands killed unjustly under U.S. so-called war on terror over the last 20 years. And I said Hawaii needs the Belt of Road so we can stop being Lahaina burned, Pohakuloa bombed, Red Hill poisoned, and ethnically cleansed by the U.S. military occupation and billionaires. Because in Afghanistan, right, which was just 4/5 of Afghanistan had no electricity. The majority were living in abject poverty, much worse than any American can imagine. A lot of them didn't have indoor plumbing even, right? And just a few years ago, they were under this barrage of U.S. military bombardment. Now they have the Chinese solar companies have moved in. And Afghanistan is building more advanced solar panels than the United States or any European country. Okay, they actually said the Chinese understand, like, we don't have to worry about the violation of women's rights in Afghanistan in the medium term. If we invest and we give the opportunities of Afghanistan to build advanced industry, we develop their economy, large numbers of women will be pulled into the education system to participate in the workforce. And then over time, because they understand dialectical materialism in China, the people in Afghanistan will then be able, as their lives are being benefited, the women will become, their process of discovering their liberation will happen similar to many countries where you have huge numbers you have large education, huge numbers in the society get educated, right? So like this idea, because the U.S. thinks, we can bomb women's rights into Afghanistan. Obviously, they had a very right wing designed regimes in Afghanistan because the U.S. funded through the CIA, etc., billions of dollars and trained and backed militarily the far right to kill the left and even progressive liberals in Afghanistan. And right, but anyway, so long story short, which is that, like, but whatever you think about whether that we will succeed or not, it's not a guarantee, of course, that all that will happen. But like the alleviation of poverty is one of the methods of actually giving people human rights, and not only just economic human rights, like the right to not live in poverty, to have water, clean water, the right to a decent house, dignified housing, the right to food, right, not to starve. Not only does this economic development help in that sense, right, but it also helps later on, like the ability to get to liberate from women's rights, the other social rights, right, like women's rights, LGBTQ plus rights. To get to that point, it's very difficult. Even Palestinian queer people will say, this is where pinkwashing, imperialist Western pinkwashing comes in, which is say, we have to go into Africa. NATO and the U.S. military have to go into Africa and into Asia and Arab countries to save them from Islam, homophobia, right? Or to give them women's rights, right? But even queer Palestinians say, no, we need to end to the genocide, the suffering, and the poverty, and the siege, and then we'll look into, getting more rights for and less to getting more support for queer people in our countries. But even as we queer people, that's not our main priority, right? So this is another place where the West talks about the human rights of women and people being oppressed based upon their gender and sexual orientation. But it's all, number one, they don't really care. Right? They just use that as a weapon. Israel is known to just do this pinkwashing. It's nonsense. They don't even have gay marriage there, right? It's right. And so anyway, even on that metric, right, the West is a failure. But that's why I said, but this is part of the Belt and Road. That's why Hawaii needs Belt and Road, so that we can get this, advanced solar panels, so we can make things, instead of just being, a theme park for white people to build a illegitimate gas station on our stolen land, being paid starvation wages to shake our butt doing hula. Right, in tacky false Hawaiian culture resorts. It's not even real. It's culture appropriation and it's culture desecration. That's what Waikiki is. So I mean, we could do tourism, but under our terms and as part of a more diversified economy, where we're making advanced products that are benefiting us, not going to capitalist foreign owned corporations like Waikiki and all the Democrats and Republicans that own all the land in the most profitable hotels, like on Maui, that's currently still in threat. So anyway, so I wanted to bring that up because that's another, like, the idea that simply enshrining, we have a law that says that you have the right to freedom of speech. That doesn't mean anything. Look, it is a right. Like I said, right, the courts don't enforce anything in the West, right? But number two, like, another level of that is the economic, material reality that people need to, have their basic needs met first. Like that. This is the way that the China and the East looks at the human rights. Number one is the rights to have their material needs met. That's the most important. And then these other rights, like these, like freedom, these kind of like more abstract freedoms. These are like, these are things that, we will talk about these things in a secondary they're not unimportant, but like, we have to deal with the nitty gritty, the economic inequality and economic just lack, right? And not part of that historical, but part of that is just actually true, right? Which is that people who are in extreme people who don't have food, who cannot eat, right? Who don't have basic plumbing, who don't have their basic needs being met. And some Americans are, as I said, they're not as bad as the global majority in the Africa, Asia, and Latin America, but they're falling down there, right? Americans are like running short on a lot of food. Americans, housing wise, they barely anyone can afford decent, like, functioning housing that isn't falling apart. Most Americans can't afford the average rent. Most Americans on the average American salary cannot afford the average rent, which is like $2,000 now. I don't know what it is exactly, but it's horrible, right? So those are all human rights, but America doesn't like even think about dealing with. It doesn't even like classify those. Well, if you're living in a tent and you're eating like a spoonfuls of peanut butter for dinner, your human rights are being met because you have the freedom to say whatever you want, right? You have freedom of speech, right? You can be a loudmouth Christian or Jewish, you have freedom of speech. You have freedom of religion, but you're living in a tent and you're eating like a handful of Cheerios for dinner. So that's all your human rights right there, right? See, the West doesn't care about the most important human rights. That's why they leave those out, right? Because they know that, like, as long as people who have their material needs being met, which is cis, white, straight, middle class people, especially white men, right? They don't even think about those other things as rights because they just always had them, right? As white people, they just always had food and housing, and they never not had toilets, right? When was the last time an American like couldn't find a toilet and they had to like poop into like a river or something? And with very few people selectively going off into the Alaskan wilderness because they watch a bad Netflix series with fake survivalists from Hollywood pretending to be naked and afraid in the jungle. Outside of wannabe LARPing poverty white people, right? When has it actually been a thought? The answer is it hasn't, right? When have white people ever been not able to say whatever the fuck they wanted, no matter how stupid, no matter how ignorant, right? It's actually like these rights are just these are just platitudes. These are just nonsense that's put into constitutions in the West and into court documents to make it seem like they're legitimate. How do we get human rights? So we get human rights through resistance, economic and military resistance, and education. All these. I'm not saying like there can never be, so we should never have courts again, like. And like I shouldn't show up for a court. You got to do what you have to do under the current circumstances you're in. And like, courts can function, to an extent, and they shouldn't be over relied upon. It's just economic. It's just efficiency wide a waste of a lot of talent. It's not necessary. We do need education, right? Do we need people reading do we need people spending like all day, every day reading books and then making like 75-hour YouTube video essays? I like a good video essay, right? But do we need 300 million people, right? While the world is burning and people are being genocided, right? Spending all their time like researching this, like making taking 60 hours a week to like talk about their favorite anime, and like how like, I don't know, just some random white philosopher connects to, the inner intricacies of Attack on Titan, and that in a way that's disconnected from the present world that's literally on fucking fire, right? Do we need that level? You could, in a world that wasn't literally threatened, when people aren't like literally having their children blown up by your country that you're supposed to be doing something about, maybe. But what we find is like overeducation is a tool of people power misallocation, right? over litigation, right? The obsession with the courtroom, with Western education, I mean, putting in quotes, with these discursive battles, like many things need to be discussed and things need to be learned, but a lot is wasted, right, in these kind of cul-de-sac dead ends, so that the 800 million white people don't have to actually do anything materially and just keep consuming and keep the capitalist system going and the racist capitalist colonial system going, right? So actually a lot of that is in a lot of what passes for, I would argue, Western discourse is a lot of neurons moving. There's a lot of like energy being generated, right? But it kind like the courtrooms that have all litigated, like the millions upon millions of courtroom hours that have litigated the Palestinian-Israeli question and fight, right? What has that materially produced other than $200,000 lawyer salaries? Attorney bills were paid, right? New York liberal and progressive and even left attorney bills like Stephen Donziger, their bills were paid, right? Their flat was paid. They got enough food. They got some food to eat as an attorney. They paid their electric bill, right? But how has the Palestinian human rights actually advanced, right? Are the Palestinians now being genocided less because of the millions of hours that millions of people have spent litigating and trying to discursively argue with Nazis? Which, I mean, just to say the average Western supported regime. Has that moved it very much? Or could that time have been better spent, right? Organizing some other kind of direct action, or actually trying to figure out how you're going to build the actual democracy and human rights in your own country for the first time. And obviously, like, I mean, and I would actually argue, in fact, that like sharing the Palestinians' actual direct actions right now, as a part of a wider global axis of resistance is more important than these kind of like esoteric human rights metaphysical discussions. Is more important than I would argue it's more important than the litigation. As shout out again to South Africa for bringing it to the International Criminal Court. But the International Criminal Court, like, again, I like to compare it, like courtrooms are kind of like, they're like the two commanders, like the French and the British sending out their officers on a battlefield, right? And the officers will, in a courtroom, the officers come together and they say, well, Britain, if you attack our 20,000 French soldiers, you will lose in this particular battle, somewhere, I don't know, we're here, north of the Champs-Élysées. If you attack us here, we have 20,000, you only have 15,000. And the British will say, well, we have cavalry. And the French will say, well, we have catapult, we have the trebuchet. And the British will say, okay, well, we'll cut off your supply lines with this attack. And they negotiate, right? But at the end of the day, right, if there isn't, the West only understands barbarism, right? It's just like, we are going to kill you and take your stuff. And then in the courtroom, right, you can say the United States is guilty of human rights violations, blah, blah, blah. And that's true. And the United States must stop its support of Israel, and Israel must stop its genocide of Palestine. And then Israel will say, no. And then the court will say, but you did the genocide. Well, we don't care. We want that land and this money, and the U.S. oligarchy wants that money and the Ben Gurion Canal. That's worth billions. And then they say, but look at all this, right? Well, no. So at that point, right? So that's where if the International Criminal Court if you say no, if you say we will not stop genociding, then what? Then Yemen, Iran, Hezbollah, and Palestine will destroy you. And then that's why Israel is suddenly going, maybe we need to talk about a ceasefire. It's not because Israel believes anything. It gives a shit about human rights, right? Actually, in that sense, it's kind of like the International Criminal Court. It's not the court. The International Criminal Courts, when Westerners are involved, when imperialist, genocidal, capitalist, racist countries are involved, court is not needed. All you need is, right now, Saudi, Israeli, and American heads are meeting in Iran. right? You don't need an international criminal court. You just sit down with the people that are, the legitimate human rights enforcing government. Iran has been supporting Palestine this whole time. And Iran is like one of the major forces in the axis of resistance. That's why the U.S. attacked and assassinated General Soleimani, who is an architect of the anti-imperial resistance in the Arab world, a billion peoples in West Asia, right? So you don't need a court for that. In fact, the court is just a bunch of pomp and circumstance, right? Because the West don't respect law. What the fuck is the point of a court? When the United States and Europe feed, house, and clothe their people, don't have multi-trillion-dollar budgets committing planetary human rights violations, and they have even a somewhat existing, somewhat morally upstanding, not even perfect, just a somewhat democratic, somewhat moral system in the US and Europe and Canada and all of those other Western countries, then we can talk about maybe having court. Then we can talk about maybe courts will do something useful, right? But court is not. That's not what we're. This is like starting up a court again. This is like starting up a courtroom on a battlefield between Britain and France. They're going, let's all hear a ceremony. The British and the French would kill all of the judges with their wigs on. You know what I'm saying? They just be like, no, we're here to kill people, right? We're Britain and France. We go around and kill people, steal shit, and then lie about that in books later. It's called history. It's called Western history, right? It's called anthropology, sociology, human rights, and all that bullshit, right? It's called social Darwinism, right? We don't care about what you have to say, human rights experts. We're Westerners. We kill people and take shit while we act civilized. So, but the thing is, that's still where the U.S. is, and that's still where Europe is. So the courts are not needed. What the negotiations are happening right now. Iran picks up the phone if they want. Russian and Chinese are saying, we're not even picking up the phone, right? Because you don't even want to talk like normal adults. You're baby. You're like your British and French predecessors who were infantile children, but you're like literally in a diaper, like specifically Pampers, as Hamas pointed out about the Israeli soldiers, who are all cowards, getting their asses kicked. So that's where human rights are actually defended, and I should probably be ending soon. Before I get more and more mask off about less and less kind to the infants of the world. But yeah, anyways, on the final topic, so the human rights are defended by direct conflict. Unfortunately, not ideally. Again, ideally you have a civilized country like China where you just like have functioning courts and governments that give human rights, right? And they also give human rights to Afghanistan and Iraq by alleviating their poverty, which is some of the most important human rights, to not be in poverty, right? But because you're in the US, you're not in China, and you're in Europe, you're not in China, it's direct military struggle to even get justice. Like even not even in your country, but like outside your country. The US might be fighting a civil war soon, It's not a guarantee that a military struggle also doesn't guarantee that you're going to have human rights. You could have a U.S. military struggle between the Republicans and the Democrats, neither of which give a shit about human rights. Right? So, I mean, in that sense, like, people getting at least having a basic education about those things that are actually relevant and important and also true about history, power, dynamics, economics. Those are important things, right? So that people don't just start fighting for nothing. I mean, much of the Arab world was intentionally divided and fighting along lines designed by the U.S. and Britain, like doing the Roman thing, which is divide and conquer, like Sunni, Shiite, etc. And then it's another reason why they assassinated General Soleimani, because the Iranians, he devised and articulated a plan to unify the axis of the Arab peoples who were divided along lines that were conducive to human rights, which is fighting U.S., Israel, and Western powers as a united front, that's what you're seeing with Hezbollah, Hamas, and other Palestinian organizations, Syrian forces, Iraq forces, and Yemen, all lining up against the actual oppressor. Right? So, but that is the case. So how do you enforce human rights? The answer is they are fought for in this moment. It's a huge toll, right? It costs many lives. It's costing many people's extreme levels of suffering that everybody's witnessing. But it is not coming from, again, it is not coming from the West. It's not coming from a vote. It's not coming from a court. And just one more shout out for I had one more from where Yemen is at. Because last week I did a video about Yemen and what was it? The paper tiger is burning. And so, that was more about the U.S. military might collapsing, right? And it not able to get away with. I mean, it's really in this sense, right? Today, Yemen is, of course, currently still directly fighting for the liberation of Gaza. So Yemen is an entire country, as I pointed out last week. Yemen is the only entire country, sovereign country, that has fully dedicated itself, and its people are also dedicated. Yemen has a democracy. Yemen is more democratic than any Western country, like Gaza. And Yemen has dedicated their military forces to directly confronting the human rights violations and the genocide of the U.S. and the West. All the countries that have sent their Prosperity Guardian coalition, that has failed. It has failed. It is gone. It is dead. It has lost, as we know now. Yemen is continuing that fight. The Red Sea continues to be blockaded. The port of Eilat has, for the first time in its entire history of decades and decades, the Israeli port has 0 ships in it. So again, what Yemen is doing, it's the single act of Yemen's military involvement, cutting off the Strait of Bab al-Mandab and the Red Sea, that is having more impact than basically the entire rest of the world combined. In that fight, to strangle economically and also militarily hinder the genocidal Israeli entity. So that's a part of the struggle that is happening. It is, and again, it's not legal. It's not voting. It's not, protesting helps if there's somebody who has a conscience that you're talking to, right? But Yemen knows that they're not protesting. They do have big actions to rally everybody together and show how much support there is, right? But then, like, going to the White House and going, we're the Yemenis pro-Palestine front, and we're here to tell America that you're doing genocide. And America's like, I know we're doing genocide. I don't give a shit. So that's why Yemen is part of that enforcer of human rights around the world. Actually, as I said, Yemen is only like large country, right? Of course, the Palestinians are doing that. There are other entities around inside of as I've already talked about them, in West Asia or the Middle East, that are also engaged in enforcing human rights. And then there are also, there's many individuals who support it. But as a country, they're the only one. And in fact, interestingly, and this I want to end on this. So Yemen has actually, in fact, they have gone to the point, they have come out and said here, right? One slogan that is starting to reverberate in Yemen is to support the oppressed peoples of the world. It is started as a tweet by senior Ansar Allah. They sometimes, in a derogatory way, refer to as the Houthis or the Houthis, and often the Houthi rebels to kind of marginalize them and make them seem less significant than they are. But anyways, it's a U.S. think tank term that they came up with, basically. But anyways, Ansar Allah figure Emin al-Bukaiti, and is now spreading like wildfire among the population. They will grant the very supportive actions. Yemen will grant very supportive actions that they are giving to the Palestinian people right now to any other people on the planet facing annihilation by colonialism and imperialism. It's also important to highlight that in the context above, the left wing of Yemen's Ansar Allah staged a protest outside the abandoned U.S. embassy in Sana'a in 2019 in a show of symbolic solidarity with Venezuela and its people. And as you can see, there's they are not a monolith. They have many different different groups, political formations inside of Yemen, but they are united in these deep values that there's reasons why it's Yemen. There's ancient historical millennia old reasons why it's Yemen that is doing this, because they have a particular culture that is they have a very like deep moral culture of purity, in the sense of like rooting out corruption and only doing what is truly the right thing, and they really do not tolerate injustice, right? That's one of the reasons why they could not stand by. They as a country, not just the government, the whole people got involved. The United States tried to bribe Yemeni officials and people, and the United States even said we can't. We tried to offer money and salaries to Yemen to stop their involvement, but the Yemen people will not be bribed. They cannot be bribed. Like, they can't find anyone. That's what I mean. Imagine in America, if you offered $1 million to do something, right? How many people in the US or Europe would do something for money? I mean, just like slightly, not necessarily in the valleys, but there's a lot of money involved. I mean, it's basically like most of the West. I mean, let's be real, right? And even a lot of, even in Egypt, obviously that's why they have puppet governments, because somebody's willing to sell out their people, right? But in Yemen, they cannot find anybody. The U.S. has even just said, like, we can't find anybody to bribe. That's how actually human rights respecting they are as a culture and as a government and as, you know, the different political groups. They have, like, some of them are. This one is of course, this is like, I believe this is the Yemenis socialist or communist. One of their communist or socialist organizations. They have very, very strong. I think majority of Yemen is in this one of the socialist organizations. But then they're also, of course, they are, you know, they are Muslim, they are Arab people. But Arab is also not a unifying. They're different. They're different peoples within Arab. Like Syrians are not the same as Saudis, and they're not the same as Yemen people either. But long story short, that's another thing to keep in mind is but they do have a very strong, like, anti-imperial, obviously deeply anti-imperial and very socialist and communist. They have large socialist and communist subgroups, but they're all united in this ideas of everyone deserves. They actually deeply believe in and they enforce human rights. Like, everyone needs food. Everyone will get food. Everyone gets fed, right? And many, actually, if you've ever been to an actual mosque, you would know that this is actually part of their culture, is making sure everyone is fed and everyone is taken care of, right? They'll have like regular, like, they'll just cook and food and give the food out to people. Not doesn't matter what religion you are, doesn't matter what race you are, doesn't matter, right? They have it's deeply enshrined in their culture. Anyways, but they also supported Venezuela in that time, and not only that, but stopping genocide, healthcare, housing. I mean, the hospital system was created by the Muslim world, the Bimaristan system, almost a millennia ago, in order to take care of sick and ill people, no matter their race, their gender, religion. The Muslims took care of Christians and Jewish people alike, took care of everyone, right? For free. And this is often forgotten by Westerns, especially Christians, who don't want to remember that their Western Christians are far less moral than the average Muslim. But anyways, the one slogan that is starting to reverberate in Yemen is support the oppressed peoples of the world. They will grant supportive actions they're giving to Palestinian people. Speaking of human rights, right? They will grant these supportive actions they're giving to the Palestinians right now to any other people on the planet facing annihilation by colonialism and imperialism. Okay? So colonialism itself, imperialism itself, is a human rights violation. De facto, the entire United States. De facto, all of NATO. Every one of those countries. Right? Just because of that, you're already in violation of human rights. So there's this nonsense that you defend human rights. But Yemen is saying they're going to actually support this. So I said, well, hey, Yemen, Hawaii welcomes Yemen to our U.S. colonized country when possible. The illegal genocide of the U.S. occupation of Hawaii banned our language and culture, steals our land, poisons our water, and mass incarcerates us. So we look forward to the Yemen military, coming to Hawaii when it's possible. There are many places that suffer worse than us. Like, obviously, other countries in the Arab world. Afghanistan is still suffering, although China is helping them. I wish China would help us. China and Yemen to come get the U.S. military imperial occupation out and trying to help us with the poverty alleviation, human rights. But if you didn't know this, in Hawaii, the highest rate of police killings is in Hawaii, disproportionately Pacific Islander. We are the number one most economically unequal state, worse than every other state, including New York, D.C., and L.A. The U.S. mass incarcerates Native Hawaiians in the school-to-prison pipeline. We have the most children rounded up. They target Native Hawaiians. That's a human rights violation. Racist over-policing and targeting our children to be thrown into prison. The U.S. banned our Hawaiian language and culture. That's a human rights violation. The U.S. still punishes children for speaking Hawaiian today. Less than 100 kids spoken in the 80s. There's a child that was punished for speaking Hawaiian in Hawaii. That's a human rights violation. And this child some people ask me, how is that child doing, right? And I tell them, this child, this girl, you can go ask Hawaiian cowgirl. This is one of thousands of Hawaiian children. The teacher in the U.S. public school said you must not speak any Hawaiian anywhere. Okay, he's a white racist teacher, but that's most of the teachers in Hawaii. The U.S. don't tell you that, do they? Yeah. The children in Hawaii are still punished for speaking in 2023. They're still punished for speaking Hawaiian. Nothing happened to the teacher. Nothing happened to the principal. Nothing happened to any of the political officials in this area. Right? So Yemen, the United States doesn't even enforce basic language rights of Native Hawaiians. In fact, it hurts our languages. My sister's school was forcefully defunded. That's why my sister, she no longer teach. My sister used to teach at a Hawaiian immersion school to make sure Native Hawaiians like myself can learn our language. My sister is no longer teaching at that school because they made it impossible for her to teach there. So the United States is literally directly crushing Hawaiians' language and culture. Even though they're not formally banned, they haven't formally banned it, they are still economically, ethnically cleansing us. They're punishing. So Yemen, I mean, that's not, again, it's more serious in Palestine, but this is all human rights violations. This is racism. This is cultural genocide. These are under the United Nations Declarations of Rights of Indigenous People, under the United Nations clauses, right? One of them, which the U.S. has signed on to, is, the denationalization, making life in whole or in part impossible or difficult for a particular people, the removal of language, removal of symbol, removal of the print in the language of the native people, which the U.S. is all guilty of to this day, not historically, right now. So on top of the U.S. military occupation, the Native Hawaiians were targeted by CPS. The U.S. military occupation, the bombing of all of our islands, right? So Yemen, when you are available, please come to Hawaii. And if you want more on that, I have this entire thread beneath this, right? The U.S. banned our language and culture, let us die in the Maui fires, devastated our universal healthcare, illegally occupies Hawaii to this day. I already showed the UN tweet. This is the U.S. This is the Hawaii's petition against annexation that the U.S. violated. The statehood vote was rigged by the U.S. military, and the United States used white citizens of America to vote as Native Hawaiians fraudulently. So the state of Hawaii itself is a legal fiction. This is the advanced Hawaiian country we had before the United States invaded. This is the United States that had black full citizens when the U.S. had slavery. The U.S. still has massive racism against black people, as ask any black American. Those are all human rights violations, by the way. So anyways, and the U.S. military occupation in Hawaii is itself a violation of international law. So also, the U.S. continues to punish. This is a college professor who was arrested for speaking Hawaiian in a court. This is Hawaii. This is the police arresting Hawaiians. The economic inequality, which is also a human rights violation, is, as I said, the worst in Hawaii. We have the highest homelessness population. The United States is doing absolutely nothing. The United States, in fact, is celebrating the population of Hawaiians in Hawaii dropping every decade. The population of Hawaiians in Hawaii is dropping by 10% per decade. Right? That's ethnic cleansing. I mean, it's not as fast as Palestine, but it's still ethnic cleansing. Also, the richest people in the world own entire swaths of Hawaii. Mark Zuckerberg's building a bunker on Kauai on our stolen land. He owns an entire fresh water supply. These are all, when we don't have fresh water, these are all human rights violations of Native Hawaiians. The U.S., as I said, bombs Puakalua, bombs Ko'olave, poisoned our water at Red Hill, hasn't cleaned it up. They just started defueling. They're not cleaned it up. The U.S. military occupies 25% of our land. All human rights violations, all illegal. Okay? So anyways, so when Yemen, Hawaii invites Yemen to enforce human rights in Hawaii against the human rights violator of the United States. So we look forward to that day. And hopefully Hawaii can join the Belt and Road so we can finally have our poverty alleviated, have actually productive jobs in Hawaii, not have our cultural desecrated by the U.S. Western tourism industry that doesn't help us at all, and stop being displaced by homelessness. And so we look forward to the axis of resistance with Yemen and China coming together against the U.S. occupation. After which, I think Hawaii could be the base of operations to defend human rights in North America. So Yemen ships could stop in Hawaii, right? And the 2 million Yemen army can go to, there's a Fraser River, there's the St. Lawrence River. Yemen ships can, blockade the U.S. and Canada until, cause their economies to do, because the U.S. military can't stop the Yemen Navy. They've already shown that Yemen has already defeated the U.S. and all its allies. So the U.S. will soon be, maybe human rights need to be enforced by Yemen in Canada and the U.S. at one point. Now, I'm just speculating. I'm not saying that's what's going to happen. But I'm just saying, if Yemen is actually going to follow through, and there are people that are colonizing Canada, there are people that are imperialized, inside the United States, but most of the U.S. is white, and they're doing the colonization. But, stopping the United States military in the United States, that would be a massive blow to global imperialism and colonialism. And Hawaii would make Hawaii was an unsinkable aircraft carrier for the United States and the Europeans to plunder Asia and the Indo-Pacific and launch wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Speaking of that, right? So Hawaii could be an unsinkable aircraft carrier to decolonize the United States and stop the U.S. and the West from imperialism. I'm just saying, we have a lot of ports already here. All we got to do is get rid of the United States genocide USS Eisenhower, the USS Arizona, which is leaking oil in our harbor, and get rid of all this toxic shit. The Chinese could help clean that up, and then Hawaii could be a part where Hawaiians benefit from all the trade. There would be no Jones Act, which makes everything in Hawaii take 3 times as long, and it's twice as expensive because every product in Hawaii has to go to a U.S. California port and then to Hawaii. Why can't the Chinese ship straight to Hawaii? Like Holly bought some headphones and some coffee holders and just objects. Bought some Shin and Temu objects. It takes like a month to get here. Why can't the Chinese ships come straight to Hawaii? The reason why is because of Western human rights violations and illegitimate forced colonization of Hawaii. So the Chinese ships come straight here, when the Yemen ships can come here, and then they go to the United States and then help liberate California from their unjust plutocracy. So, anyways, but I've been talking a long time, and now it's the end. I'm just joking. None of that's gonna happen. None of that's all in the video game. Neofeud is a game though that does support everything we do here. It is on Steam. Neofeud is a game that's on Steam. It does support everything we do here. It is on sale now, so if you want to help us out, consider picking it up. It does help to keep the Silver Spook Cooperative going, which is a Nader Fine run anti-capitalist, anti-imperialist cooperative. You can also support us with direct support on Ko-Fi. That helps us keep on doing this work. And also, of course, you can help us out on Patreon at patreon.com/Neofeud. At patreon.com/Neofeud, you can give us ongoing support, get access to the Silver Spook Discord, behind the scenes at the Silver Spook Cooperative, like our land back work, our maintaining the Silver Spook Cooperative compound, and the Silver Spook games work, like Neofeud 2, that are educational and left activism as well as entertainment. You can also get access to the Silver Spook University, which is 1,000 hours of my content categorized by topic. And I'm also working on another project as a committee member of a anti-PragerU, like left YouTube educational initiative called Civic Seed, which I'm interested in. I can't say too much about that at the moment, but really interested to work with that group. And I might report about that on the Patreon as well. You can follow at Silverspook. Well, you can also get Neofeud at itch.io for Windows and for Mac and for Linux. Neofeud on itch.io is also available for on sale, and it's also maximum revenue comes to us when you buy it that way. There's also Decolonators, Pigeonwick Gun, Indigenous Star, and lots of other games. And there's a book Holly wrote called Woman, which is about Holly was raised in right-wing evangelical Christianity, and it's a critique of that world through a story of Jesus, but the Jesus story in the Bible, but told from Mary's perspective. And it's free, or you can throw some money our way when you pick it up. You can also follow at Silverspook Games at Octanon.social, at Silverspook Games at Mastodon.social, and also on Twitter, Silverspook Guy, or on Twitter, Silver Spook Games, minus the E in silver for game stuff. And you can also follow Yaya Sari, the head of. No, you don't have to follow that person. You can also follow. There are all the Native Hawaiians that are. They're really cheering for Yemen, and one of them is Jamaica. Jamaica Osorio is another Native Hawaiian activist and educator. So I think we gotta get this going. Jamaica Osorio says I fucking love Yemen. So let's get this going. Let's get the Hawaii Yemen connection going. You join the Axis of Resistance. But anyways, Silver Spook guy. You can also follow Terminus C. Terminus C is Terminus Cyberstar. Terminus Cyberstar is a low poly cyberpunk immersive sim in the vein of Deus Ex and System Shock. It's also a game that I am the content director and lead writer of, and you can follow that to learn about that. Holly, you can follow at the Tech Fairy. Holly is, of course, wife and partner here with the Silver Spook Cooperative, and myself, producer and manager with K-Nick's Twitch stream, music and variety show, parent and caregiver here to Native Hawaiian children, writer and educator, and person who wears masks because that's important under pandemics. And Holly also shares very important information, so don't forget to follow that as well. And finally, thank you to all of these people on the list here who help us out through Patreon to keep doing this work, that without whose support it makes it. Thank you for supporting the human rights of the Silver Spook Cooperative, because without the US dollars that we technically was not our currency, but we have to use it because of US colonization. Thank you for supporting our continued housing, food, and transportation and basic needs here at the Silver Spook Cooperative, so that we can keep doing this work that we do here. So thanks for doing your human rights work. You're doing more than the UN, FEMA, and Red Cross do in Hawaii. So good job. And we will be back in the evening to talk about Neofeud 2 and other fun stuff. And so until next time, keep your mirror safe polished. Don't violate them human rights. Support the enforcers and actual givers of human rights, such as the Axis of Resistance, the Palestinians, the great people of Yemen, etc. And